So this morning I want to ask you, first of all, how many of you guys have ever found yourself in a situation where you felt like there was no way out? There was no door out, right? Well, I think we've all found ourselves in that situation. I find myself in this situation all the time. Oftentimes, it's linked to the fact that I have some ADD tendencies in my life. Anybody know anybody like that? Okay, gets distracted really easy, okay? Well, this is a common scenario at my house. Many of you guys know my wife, Kara. Absolutely love her, cherish her, and will do anything for her, right? So when she asks me to do things like, Mark, honey, could you take the trash out? What do I say, ladies? Yes, you betcha. Okay, so being the good husband that I am, I say, yes, ma'am, I certainly will. Now, on my way to doing that, let's say I get a text message or something, all right? You guys are following me. And I glance out of my phone, and hey, it's something important. I've got to respond real quick. And real quick turns into a 2-minute text back or maybe a 3-minute text back. And I completely forget what I'm supposed to be doing, right? And then I go back to doing something else and completely neglect the trash. Now, 15 minutes comes around, and my wife lovingly asks, Mark, have you taken out the trash? Now, in this situation, I have two possible answers, okay? The first one is, no, I haven't taken the trash out. And of course, like anybody should be, she would be aggravated. Why have you taken the trash out? Because I just asked you and you said you would, right? But the other response that I can give is I can skirt around the question, right? And I could try to avoid answering her, and I could take the trash out before she ever realizes that I never took the trash out to start with, right? So I'm in this dilemma, and I'm trying to figure out how to answer the question. Right? I think we've all been there where we just don't know how to respond. We don't know exactly what to do. And while this is a humorous example, I think that many of us can agree that sometimes life throws curveballs at us and puts us in situations where we don't know how to respond. We feel like there's no way out. We feel like we're in a dilemma that either option in our two or maybe more options is a bad choice, right? There's no way out. In fact, I would say that some of our dilemmas probably deal with God. Most likely you, or at least at some point in your past, maybe now in your present, you have had questions in your mind that seem to conflict with reality. In other words, you have questions that are in your mind where God conflicts with what you know about reality. So what are you supposed to do when it appears that choosing the right way conflicts with obeying God? In other words, the right way out, so to speak, is in opposition to what you know about God. What are you supposed to do? All right, so we're going to journey through that today. What do we do when we face a dilemma in our minds about who God is? So again, if you're jumping in the middle of our series, we're in a series called Skeptical. We've been working through the book of Mark, and that's where we're going to find ourselves today. So if you want to flip to Mark chapter 12. So we're working through several passages in Mark and looking at different people and their approaches to Jesus. It's very skeptical, you might would add. Okay. Last week, if you weren't here, we talked about a group of guys called the Pharisees. Right, and we looked at two different approaches of Jesus. We looked at one approach and we contrasted how one approach is to approach Jesus with an open heart and with an open mind. You may have questions, but at least you're approaching him with an open mind and heart to listen to what he says. But on the contrary, another approach to Jesus is to approach him with a closed mind and a closed heart. And we saw this in the Pharisees last week. You see, the Pharisees last week were the chief antagonists to the story. And this week we find them right smack dab in the middle of our story again this week. You see, last week what they wanted to show is they wanted to expose Jesus as a fool by giving him a tough question that would leave him hung out to dry and would show him to be a fool in front of all of his followers. Well, surprise, surprise, we see the same scenario but in a little different way come up again this week in Mark chapter 12. So if you're there, if you would journey along with me, we're going to be looking at verse 13 first. Later, they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. So right off the bat, you notice we have some new guys on the scene this week. We have these guys called the Herodians. I'm going to explain them in just a moment. But just to remind you, the Pharisees would have been the experts in the law of their day. In other words, they were experts in the things that they're supposed to be doing, right? They were the good people. They were the upstanding citizens. They were sticklers to following all the rules. And they would have been at that time period, if you could follow along with this logic, they would have been considered the right-wing conservatives of that time period, okay? Now, the Herodians were the exact opposite. You see, they would have been considered the left-wing liberals of that day, okay? And what's interesting about this time period was Jerusalem was just taken over not too long previously by Rome. So Jerusalem found itself under Roman rule, right? Now the Pharisees absolutely despised this, right? They did not like the Romans. They did not like the Romans trying to impose their culture, their beliefs into this new society that Rome now controlled. But the Herodians were far different, right? Whereas the Pharisees opposed the Romans, the Herodians welcomed them in and began to adapt really quickly to their new culture and their new beliefs, right? So here we have two people that do not like each other, right? The Pharisees and the Herodians did not get along. We have bitter foes working together to trap Jesus. So here in the same room, we have Rush Limbaugh and Barack Obama teaming up together to trap Jesus, right? Okay, it's just awkward. But what's interesting about this is the word trap is the word used here in this phrase. The word trap is often used oftentimes in this time period for hunting or fishing. Or if you're from up north, hunting or fishing, right? You got to add the G on, right? So this is the word that's often used when discussing hunting or fishing, this word trap, right? And what this word trap conveyed was you were trapping to kill or trapping to destroy. So when it says that they were trying to trap Jesus, we actually get a picture here that they weren't just trying to catch him, they wanted to destroy him with this question. But what's interesting about this, if you'll notice in verse 13, look at the word they. Who is the one behind the Pharisees and Herodians? It says later they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians. Now who was the they? Now we're not going to read this passage this morning, but if you look back a few chapters, you'll see that the they that conspired these Pharisees and Herodians were actually the top dog religious leaders of that time period. Now this is very interesting, right? Because some people will look at Jesus as one of the greatest religious leaders of all time, all right? But here you have the religious leaders of that day trying to conspire to trap Jesus here. So if you have a problem with religion this morning in here, Jesus had major problems with the religion, right? The religious leaders hated Jesus. They always tried to trap him. Look at verse 14 with me as we keep reading. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." Listen to this question. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? You see, what's interesting here about their approach is they build Jesus up using flattery. But what we know about this is they're saying something with their mouths, but their hearts tell a different story, right? We can all read this into the text. But what they said of him is still true, right? Jesus is not partial. He does treat everyone fairly. He is a man of integrity. His love is equal for all people, right? We see these things. But what do they do next, okay? Look at what they say. They pose on him what looks to be an impossible question to answer. You see that? They give him an either-or question where it appears that he's going to be hung either way. Consider the dilemma that Jesus faces in this moment. In other words, the dilemma that appears to be on him in this moment. They ask him, should we or should we not pay the imperial tax to Caesar? I guess taxes were no more popular then than they are now, right? So this was a tough question in our eyes, right? How would Jesus respond? You see, the imperial tax was not a normal tax. It wasn't a tax like a tax on goods or a tax on property or a tax on income. No, this was considered a head tax. And what this means is this tax essentially was you saying that I am loyal to the king. Okay, it's essentially saying I'm a subject to the Roman king, the Roman emperors at the time, or the Roman leaders, okay? And what's interesting is it's not actually a lot of money. One denarius is not a lot of money. So it wasn't like an overbearing tax. One denarius actually would have been like one day's wages for a lower income working citizen of that time. Okay, so it wasn't a lot of money. It was the principle, right? It was essentially them saying, I'm handing you over this money to show you my loyalty. And the Jews absolutely rejected this. So of all the taxes in Rome, this was the worst. So listen to this. If Jesus said, yes, you should pay these taxes, it would have infuriated the crowds. It would have been like they were submitting to Caesar here, and they would have been endorsing the Roman government. It would have been like spitting in the face of the Jewish heritage. And in all honesty, for many of them, it would have been like spitting in the face of God, because what they were doing in their eyes was they were leaving their Jewish heritage to follow this now Roman leader. But listen to this. If Jesus said no, they shouldn't pay the taxes, then he probably would have been arrested on grounds for treason against the Roman government. And most likely he would have been punished, maybe even killed for this rebellion. You see, from the outside looking in, it appears that there's no way out. It appears that Jesus was trapped here. So the question was posed to Jesus was an either-or question. You notice that? In other words, you have two options, and neither one of them appear to be a good answer. Many of us in the room today, I would argue, are skeptical because of either-or questions we have about God, and we have no answer for. We don't think there's a satisfying answer out there for the question we have in our mind. You feel like there's no way out. Some of you guys, honestly, you have some serious barriers or dilemmas between you and God because you don't know how to respond to some of the questions that either have arisen in your own mind or either maybe others have posed on you. Like this: why would Carrie Underwood sing a song suggesting for Jesus to take the wheel when the automobile hasn't even been created yet? Why would she have done that? That's funny. That was a joke. Okay, let me throw that out there, all right? So I'm just kidding there. Okay, but seriously, some of you guys have questions about God that you can't reconcile any good answer for. Like this: do I believe science or do I believe God? Right? How many of you heard that? We feel like there's an either-or question, and there can't be any in between, right? That science opposes God. Or let me say this for some of you guys that are advancing in your career. Maybe you've been in this position. Should I choose advancement in my career, or should I choose obedience to God? Maybe for some of you married folks in here, you can identify with this. If I stay married, right, I'm either going to live in misery for the rest of my life, or either I choose divorce. Okay? It's an either-or question that we wrestle with. And for some of you teenagers in here, you wrestle with this. You feel like you have to either choose to be loved and accepted by God or to be loved and accepted by your peers. Right? We face these either-or questions that we bring on ourselves. We feel like there's no right answer. We feel like that the answer to the question conflicts with who God is. But what we must understand is we must understand the root of our dilemma. What is the root of our dilemma? The root of our dilemmas is our heart, not God. The root of our dilemmas is our heart, not God. Think about it. What was the root of the dilemma posed on Jesus? It was hatred and jealousy by the Pharisees and the Herodians. They despised Jesus, right? They felt like they were smarter than Jesus. Some of you in here would not admit it, but you feel like you're too smart for God. You feel like that if you believe in God or if you step out there in faith to claim salvation for yourself through faith, then you're believing and you're being a weakling, so to speak. In other words, you believe that faith in God is like a crutch for the weak, or maybe a way for people to feel superior over others. You see, you start out with this mindset that your reasoning, your logic, your abilities to figure things out is the only way you have in your mind to truly decide what is true or not. Right? In other words, your mind is the only thing that you can rely on. But this ignores one major truth that we must all understand. Jeremiah 17:9 says that our hearts are desperately wicked. Who can know it? You see, guys, your logic, your mind, and your heart has all been tainted by sin. Guys, your moral judgments, your thought process, your logic, guys, it's all been corrupted by sin, right? You have to admit that this is true. See, you naturally, and I naturally, reject what is true about God. It's just the way sin works. Sin opposes God. So what we must understand this morning is not to rely fully on this noggin up here of ours, right? But we must understand that wisdom always starts with God. Wisdom starts with God. Proverbs 9 verse 10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." You see, wisdom starts by understanding who God is and also realizing that you're a sinner. Because when you realize that you're a sinner and that all wisdom comes from Him, that puts us in a position to completely run to Him and rely on Him for everything that we need to understand in this life. You see, one of the most foundational questions of life for each one of our lives is the question of who is God? Or is there a God? Or are there many gods? This question about God shapes the way we view the entire world. And our answer to this question will determine how we look at every other aspect of our lives, right? Whether you believe God exists or not will impact the way you work. It will impact your home life. It will impact your school life. Wherever the situation you're in, your view of God will dictate your worldview, is what we'll call it, the lens at which you look at everything else. So some of you may push back and say, well, Mark, does that mean for those who don't believe in God that they're dumb, right? Because if wisdom starts from God, does that mean that people that don't believe in God are dumb? You see, in our eyes, they may seem very smart, right? Some of the guys on TV seem very, very smart. But listen to this. If they do not understand the basic fundamental question of who is God, the foundational question to all of life, then guys, everything else in their life is going to be not grounded in its proper foundation. That is the nature of God. You see, the nature of God gives definition to everything because He created everything for His purposes. So knowing that our heart is wicked and wisdom comes from God is the starting point. See, when we are faced with a dilemma, maybe we're not sure about how science and God work together, how does that work? You see, what we have to do is we have to step back and pray and seek God's face because He is the source of all wisdom, right? So guys, He calls us to pray. He calls us to trust. But secondly, He calls us to seek the Scriptures for wisdom. The Scriptures were given to us so that we would know God, right? So when a question comes up in our mind, most of the time when people approach me with questions, I would argue it's because they don't know the Scriptures. Because as we study the Scriptures, I would guarantee that 90% of all of the questions you have will be answered, right? It may take some time, but understanding the Scriptures will help you understand God. Guys, sometimes God just wants to give you, though, a subtle answer. As you learn to trust Him, you may not fully understand, and maybe He just wants to give you a subtle piece that it's okay, you may not understand, but you can continue to move forward and trust me. Other times, guys, God is allowing these dilemmas to come into your mind and for you to wrestle with them so that you can learn to lean on others more. This is why we have life groups here at LifeSpring Church, because we believe that this life was not made to live alone. The Christian life is made to live in community, right? And so we take these questions and these struggles that we have to our life group and we say, hey guys, I'm struggling with this. Can you help me wrestle with this hard question that I'm wrestling with? Or maybe this dilemma I'm facing at work, or maybe this situation I'm facing at home, and allow your life group to pray with you, to offer wisdom from the Scriptures, and honestly, just to be a listening ear. We need people in our lives. See, guys, your life will be constantly filled with dilemmas. You can't get past it. You do realize that sin is the exact opposite of God. So as long as sin exists, it will always cause conflict between you and God. This is why one of our core values around here is we're not done. Because we openly admit and recognize that each one of us, even if you're a believer in Jesus this morning, that sin in your life is always going to cause problems and that none of us in here are perfect. That's why we as a church want to agree to work together to fully accept and love everyone around us just the way you are, right? To have mercy and show grace to those because we have to all admit we're not perfect. So you will face dilemmas in this life. There's no question about it. The question is, will you push into God or will you push God away? Will you push into Him or will you push Him away? Right? Walking in obedience, no matter how hard it is, guys, will always liberate you. And sometimes you may not fully understand. You may not. And for some of you skeptics, this is hard because you want to feel like you understand everything. The idea of not understanding feels to you like you're walking in ignorance. But guys, no. Just because we don't understand doesn't mean we're walking in ignorance. But what this is us choosing to walk by faith, not by sight. Something the Scriptures calls us to. We're not always going to fully understand. You see, faith is trusting God more than we trust ourselves. Faith is trusting God more than we trust ourselves. Let's continue to read along this passage and see how the story wraps up. Look at verse 15 with me. Jesus refuses to be trapped into this trap they're throwing at him. But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. Why are you trying to trap me, he asked. Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. So they brought him a coin. And he asked them, whose image is this? And whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God." And they were amazed by him. Now, the interesting thing about this coin, guys, this denarius, was that it had a picture of Caesar on it. So when Jesus held it up, it would have had a picture of Caesar on it, and it would have read this inscribed in the coin: Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. So on this coin was a picture of Caesar, and it was ascribing him to be the Son of God. He was deity himself, is what this coin was saying. So this coin would have been idolatry to many Jews, because essentially it was saying that Caesar was God, right? This would have been very, very offensive to the Jews in the crowds that were listening to this conversation. Guys, this would have been like pulling out an automatic rifle at the National or the Democratic National Convention, or maybe inviting Bernie Sanders to speak at the Republican National Convention, right? This would have been awkward. There would have been tense. There would have been a lot of people that would have been on edge in the crowd, right? So Jesus here holds up a very offensive coin produced by the Romans here to show us his object lesson. Now, there's a lot of irony going on in this situation. First of all, you have Jesus, who claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be the king of this new kingdom of God that was coming into place at this time. He claimed to be the most high priest. And here he is holding up a coin of Caesar, who claimed to be the Son of God, who was the most powerful king on earth, and who claimed to be the most high priest, which we're not going to get into now, but he did. So we'll come back here in just a moment and contrast that a little bit more, but you have to see the irony here. And also, what I find very interesting about this story is Jesus does not even have a coin in his pocket. He has to ask somebody for money. So Jesus, the one who was ushering in the kingdom of God, the new king, so to speak, he was broke. He didn't have any money. And Caesar was the most rich and powerful king in the land. We're going to continue again to contrast this as we go on. But Jesus then states one very influential statement that has changed the course of human government forever. He said, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." So if you're like me, you're wondering, what exactly does this mean? Notice here that Jesus does not come down on any political side. Jesus refuses to be brought under a political party. Guys, Jesus will never fit the mold of a political party. It just won't happen. He refuses to. He doesn't come down here with the Republicans or the Democrats of their day, so to speak. And for you libertarians in the room, he didn't come down with the libertarians either, right? So what we have to realize is that Jesus will not submit to a political party. If your view, and this is a challenge for you guys, if your view of Jesus is shaped by your political agenda, then you, I would submit, are submitting to Caesar, not Christ. Christ will never submit to anyone. Or if your version of Jesus always agrees with your political opinion, you're probably not worshiping the true Jesus. You see, at times, Jesus amazed both the Republicans and the Democrats, if you will, in that time period. But at other times, he completely ticked them off, right? We have to see that Jesus does not fit the mold of politics. But let me ask you this, even more sensitive to our hearts: how do you look at other people around you? When you look at others and you hear them say something that disagrees with your political opinion, do you automatically dismiss them as idiots or bigots or not Jesus-like? I hear that phrase a lot from Christians, right? Because of their thoughts on a political issue. Guys, if your political stance dictates the way you view people, guys, your political stance has become your God. You see that? It's become the chief thing in your life. But Jesus calls us to look at people far differently. He calls us to see people through gospel eyes, not through political eyes. You see, the gospel calls us to look at people far differently. See, the gospel has no political boundaries. So if you are looking down your nose at people with a different political agenda or leanings in their minds, then guys, you're removing yourself from viewing people through the lens of the gospel. And you may think, well, what exactly does that mean, to view people through the lens of the gospel? You see, we must see everyone the same way that God sees them, as loved people who have sinned and who have fallen short of God's glory, right? We have to see everyone as people far from God, but who God desperately wants to restore back to himself. You see, the gospel tells us all, no matter where you're from, no matter your political leanings, no matter what country you live in, that our sin separates us from Him, right? But Christ came. This is the beauty of the good news, the gospel. That's what that means. But Christ came to liberate you from your sin. He came to liberate everyone from their sin if they would believe. You see, He died and took the punishment for your sin because you couldn't. You could do nothing to take care of your sin problem. You see, your sin problem was way too big, right, for you to handle. So Jesus took care of it for you. And He calls on everyone who will believe. You will be saved if you believe that I died on the cross, that I took the punishment for the sin that you deserve, and that I rose again 3 days later to give victory over sin and to give victory over death. Guys, this is how we view people through gospel eyes, to see them as people far from God who need Him. But look at this answer that Jesus gives. Jesus says, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's. This is very interesting here. And there's one word here I think is very important that's hard to see in our English translation. As many of you know, this was originally wrote in Hebrew. There's a word there that's translated give. If we can go back to verse 17 there. Give back to Caesar. What is Caesar? This word give. When we hear it, we know what give means. But in the original language, there's a little deeper meaning to that word. The word give actually means give back what he deserves. So an implication of this would be give back what he deserves, but nothing more. In other words, only give him back what he deserves is what this means. So certainly we would all have to agree here that this coin, this denarius, was Caesar's, right? And that all the money of the land was Caesar's. So certainly he deserves this tax back because after all, the money is all his. He issued it. His reserves back it up. His fat face is on it, to be honest with you. It's his money, right? So we have to admit that the money is Jesus. But what else? Or the money is Caesar's. But what else does Jesus say? He says, give back to God what is God's. Now we have to ask, what is that? What he's referring to here is the things in our life that only we can give to God. That is, that God controls everything. He issued everything in our life. He created everything in our life. So therefore, our full submission to Him as Lord is only something that we can offer to God, not to Caesar. Only God can hold that position in your heart as Lord. You see, Jesus here acknowledges the legitimacy of government in this statement, but at the same time, He also admits that God is behind it all. God's in control of every government. And in no way does our government conflict with the purposes of God. You see, some of us view government as a necessary evil, right? We think it was something we have to put up with, right, while we're on earth. But God describes government actually as good and necessary and appointed by God. See, what we must recognize is that God is sovereign and that every government, every appointed leader, no matter how bad, would not be in that office if it were not for God allowing it. See, what are some of the commands that God gives us about government in the Scriptures? So I'm going to go through and give you just a few highlights from what the New Testament teaches us about human government. First of all, the Scriptures tell us that God commands us to submit to those in authority. He tells us to submit to those in our government because He's given them the position of authority, even if we don't agree with them, right? So God has called us to submit. Secondly, He calls us to pray for them. He calls us to pray for our leaders, even if we don't agree with them, right? He calls us to thank God for those in authority, for those in our government, right? Even if we don't always agree with them, we are to thank God for them. See, followers of Christ should be the best citizens in every society because we recognize these things. You see, God uses human government to enforce laws to help curb sin. God realizes that sin would completely ravage a nation, it would completely ravage this world if it did not have boundaries. You see, anarchy, or the presence of no government, if you've ever imagined that, would be complete chaos. Murders, rapes, slavery, oppression of the weak. Guys, this would be normal everyday activity if there were no government. Those who are strongest and who have the most money, right, most power, those would be the ones controlling and oppressing everyone. See, God has appointed governments to help curb and control the effects of sin, and we should be grateful. Now, some of you may push back, and you may say, well, well, Mark, there's some terrible governments around the world. And I would agree, there are some very bad governments around the world. But listen to this. Did you realize that the majority of teaching on government in the New Testament specifically was done during a time that there was an emperor named Nero? Now, what you may not know about Nero during this time period, this was during the time of, the apostles and also the apostle Paul, right, when they lived. Now, Nero was one of the most oppressive and evil emperors of all time. He punished and killed every Christian in his path, right? So these commands that Paul wrote to submit, to pray, and to thank God for your government was during a time where Christians were being persecuted by the emperor of the land. So guys, just because a government is not bad does not mean we still do not listen to God's commands. We still have to submit, pray, and thank God for our government. But let's clarify a few things. What Jesus is not saying here is he's not saying that we have to obey our government when it disagrees with God. See, God is our Lord, not the government, right? So when it disagrees with who God is and what God's called us to be obedient to him, that's when we have a problem, right? Secondly, he's not saying that we have to love every aspect of our government. He's not. He's saying we must submit, we must pray for them, we must thank God, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're always going to agree or love every aspect of your government. And thirdly, he's not saying that we can't try to influence our government to try to line up with the will of God. He's not saying that at all. In fact, I would argue that is the Christian's obligation, right? To influence our government to reflect the will of God. But let's be careful not to miss the second half of this statement that Jesus said. When he says, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. So give back to God what is his. What exactly does this mean? It means that all of creation is God's. He made it. He owns it. He controls it. Your life is God's, even if you acknowledge him as Lord or not. Maybe you find yourself as a skeptic in this room today, and you're not sure whether you believe in God or not. Guys, whether you believe or not, God is in control. You see, many of us, though, have bought into this lie that God belongs in this sphere. We'll call this the religious sphere, okay? That God belongs over here in this nice, tidy circle where we put our Sunday morning worship services, our prayer time, our Bible studies. That's in this sphere over here, right? But then there's this other sphere of our life. We'll call this life, our work, our hobbies, our education, our career paths, our arts, if you're into the arts, the science that you study. We put this in a complete separate sphere. Some have called this the secular sacred divide. It's almost as if God is completely different than those things that are part of your everyday life. But guys, I would argue that this is a false dichotomy. What this is, and this is what our culture teaches, that this is an either-or proposition. In other words, these things do not necessarily line up with these things, so therefore let's keep them separate, right? You keep your religion out of your work, you keep your religion out of your schooling, you keep your religion out of your passions, your joys, your hobbies, whatever it may be. But I would argue the exact opposite. As we read the scriptures, we see that every aspect of our life finds its roots in God. After all, he made it all, right? He made it, he controls it, so therefore, he undergirds everything that we do. And guys, God created everything for his good. And he created it purposeful. Let me give you a few examples here. Let me just walk through some of the things and highlight, so maybe this will make a little bit more sense. The sciences. Why are the sciences there? The sciences exist to reflect and magnify his beauty. They're also to show his purposes behind creation and how things work and to reflect God's nature. The arts are to magnify God's beauty, his creativity, and the minds of people, his prized creation, right? The arts are to scream glory to God by the way they're presented. Our marriages is to represent the gospel, the union of God to his people, and to magnify that to everyone who looks in. Education. How are we to view education? Education is to reflect the knowledge and wisdom of God and to ground all disciplines in this life to the very nature of God. That's where education must find its roots. Our work. How are we to view work? Work is seen to be worship to God in our eyes. We perform our duties. We perform the skills that God has given us, right, graciously. We perform those to worship Him, to bring Him glory in everything we do. How about your hobbies? Your hobbies are there, guys, because God created the world in such a way that you can enjoy it, right? And that you can enjoy the things that He has given you passions for, but we're to do so for His glory, right? To show Him that, God, I am so grateful and thankful for everything you have given me to enjoy. Guys, God is not the fun squasher that many of us think He is. He created all of creation to worship Him. You see, God is not in some separate sphere from the rest of our life. No. He gives purpose to all of your life. And what's interesting here is the coin that they held up earlier, the denarius, it was stamped with a picture of Caesar, right? We people are stamped as well. We're stamped with the very image of God. We were made in His image, and we were made and created to worship Him with our lives. 1 Corinthians 10:31, Paul says this, and you can read along with me. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. In other words, that passage is not just about eating and drinking. He's saying whatever you do, your hobbies, your workforce, your education, your home life, everything is to be done. Every thought, every action is to be done to the glory of God. Your political stances is to be submitted to God, right? Everything is for His glory. You see, we were all designed to worship. You see, many of us, though, view worship as something you do here on a Sunday morning in a church service, perhaps, right? But worship is so much more. Worship starts in our heart. Worship is what you value and treasure above all things. Even for you skeptics in the room, you worship something. You worship your life. You worship your family. You worship your job. And for some of you guys, you worship your intellect. However, just because you worship does not mean you are properly worshiping, right? In fact, I would argue if you're worshiping anything other than God Himself, it will always leave you empty. It will always leave you hopeless, and it will always leave you unfulfilled. Guys, Jesus, the King with no money, right? Who did not parade about His earthly power like Caesar did. He was not just another run-of-the-mill king. No. He was the King of kings and the Lord of lords. And He calls us all to worship Him because He deserves it. Guys, He freely gives us the opportunity to worship Him. He doesn't force us to. That's the beauty of Jesus. In fact, I would say this, true worship is the only thing that will satisfy the cravings of your soul. If you're skeptical today, you have to realize you were made to worship Him. And anything short of that will always leave you wanting. But this begs the question, what does true worship of God even look like? What does it look like? First of all, it starts with us understanding that our sin hinders us from worshiping God rightly. Sin is almost like a brick wall between us and God. So if you have never trusted in Jesus, you have never begun a relationship with Him, you have to realize that sin stands between you and God, and He doesn't receive your worship rightly. Guys, He receives worship when we worship through His Son. You see, what you have to realize, and this is stepping back here for a second, is that if you have never trusted Jesus, you have a far bigger problem than your political stance, right? Sin stands between you and God, and that sin deserves to be punished forever in hell. But the beauty of Jesus is that He came passionately after us. He became a man. He came to earth as God in the flesh. He died on a cross to take the punishment that you and I deserve because of our sin. Guys, this is the beauty of the gospel. You see, your sin debt is way too big for you to pay. You can never pay it. And Jesus gladly and willfully paid it for you. You see, Christ is calling every one of us today to submit to Him. To say, yes, I have my questions that I'm going to continue to wrestle with. But what I need now is I need Christ in my life. So guys, He calls on you to receive Him in faith today.